This is Africa Television Network, transmitting on Time Warner Cable Channel 168. Coming up next is Immigration Matters, and today, Ann Badmus will be discussing on family immigration.
Welcome to Immigration Matters on the Africa Television Network. I'm Ann Badmus, and I'm an attorney who has been helping immigrant families live and work legally in the United States for the past 15 years. We're here today to give you information that you, your family, your friends, or other relatives may use in dealing with immigration matters in the United States. Before we begin, I'd like to let you know that, of course, this information provided here is for informational purposes only. It is not considered legal advice, and you really should not depend on it for your specific circumstance. Every situation is different, although the law can seem general and can seem fairly easy to complete forms. Please keep in mind that there's a lot of law and complex law behind all these immigration issues, so you have to make sure that your situation has been addressed individually. If you need legal assistance with your immigration matter, please call 469-916-7900, or also you can contact us through our website at www.badmuslaw.com. So today we're going to be talking about family immigration. According to the government, family immigration is the way that most people immigrate or become permanent residents in the United States. So it's a very important way for persons who are here in the U.S., who are already U.S. citizens or permanent residents, and those who want to come to the United States to learn about how you can legalize your status in the United States through family immigration. Last week, our last episode, we talked about who can sponsor, what individuals can sponsor for particular family members. As we explained, U.S. citizens and permanent residents are the only individuals who can sponsor other family members for permanent residence or the green card as we know it. For U.S. citizens, they can sponsor parents, husband, wife, or fiancé. They can sponsor their children, and they can also sponsor a brother or sister. So there are about four different categories of relationships that can be sponsored by a U.S. citizen. For permanent residents, that number goes down to 2. Permanent residents can sponsor their husband and wife or their children. Today, we're going to talk more specifically about the husband and wife situation. How do you go about sponsoring, as a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, your husband and wife, whether they're here in the United States or not? The first part of the process is very important to understand what the government considers to be a husband and wife relationship and what you have to prove to the government as far as whether you do have a valid husband and wife relationship that the government can recognize and approve for permanent residents. First of all, let's talk about marriage. Of course, we understand that marriage usually means a wedding. And so if a wedding takes place and is recognized in a state or in a country, then that is considered a valid marriage. And normally how you prove that it is a valid marriage in terms of legally being a marriage is that you provide a marriage certificate issued either by the state if you got married in the United States or by the government that's responsible for giving marriage certificates in the country where you got married. It does not matter that you didn't get married in the United States, and that's not required, but it does have to be a legally recognized marriage. There are some other types of marriages that can be a little unusual in terms of the validity or the legality of those marriages, and these are areas that I'd just like to briefly talk about. As we talked about, if you have a registered marriage with your state or government, then you only need to provide the proof of the registered marriage or the registration, the marriage certificate. However, if you have maybe what's called a customary marriage, which sometimes happens in Africa and other countries or other continents. Basically, customary marriage may not necessarily be registered with the government there. For example, in Ghana, you may have a customary or what they call tribal marriage, in which there's a ceremony and the families and everyone recognizes it as a true marriage. However, it's not been registered with the government, but the government of Ghana does recognize that marriage. So if you don't have an actual marriage certificate because you have a customary marriage, then you can still prove your marriage relationship, and that is by essentially providing proof of your celebrations, celebration of the marriage, such as pictures, wedding announcements, anything that you use to let people know about your marriage. In addition, you can also show them things such as wedding cards or letters from friends or relatives that recognize that you were married on a particular date. They also have what's called marriage by proxy, which in some countries or some religions is permitted, where the bride and the groom are not physically together at the time of marriage. Sometimes it's called a telephone marriage, and that essentially means that the bride may be continents away in a different country, and the groom is here in the U.S., for example, and they marry by telephone. They conduct a marriage ceremony over the telephone, both agreeing to the marriage. And that marriage is then registered with the country in which it's recognized. And in fact, in some states of the United States, a marriage by proxy is also recognized. So there would be a certificate on record that shows that these two persons were married, however, they were not physically present in a ceremony together. That marriage is also recognized, however, you do have an additional proof to provide, and you have to prove what's called consummation of the marriage, which basically means that you have to prove that after the marriage took place, you physically met with your spouse and can prove that in terms of photographs of you together in an event or something like that. So basically you have to prove, in addition to the marriage certificate, you have to prove that you were together at some point after the marriage. And then finally we have what's called the common law marriage. And that's something that in some states is recognized, where parties don't necessarily go into an official ceremony and don't register a marriage. They don't really go through what we normally consider a wedding and a marriage taking place. However, they do live together. They actually may have children together. They may represent themselves to others as husband and wife, even though there's never been an official ceremony to that effect. Some states, such as Texas and a few others, do recognize that as a common law marriage. So if you can prove that that's the case, and again, it's similar to the idea of the customary marriage where you, or the marriage by proxy, where you can show evidence such as sworn statements from family members, proof that you've mingled finances, did all kinds of things that most people would consider married people to do, and that was represented to all as a marriage, even though there was no official ceremony that took place. So those are the kind of unusual circumstances or different circumstances that can take place that you can still prove that there was a marriage. But you also have to prove that if there were any previous marriages between previous marriages by either you as a U.S. citizen or your immigrant spouse, that those marriages were terminated. You have to provide either proof of a divorce certificate or death certificate of the previous spouse to show that before you married your new spouse, the marriage was valid because there was not any other spouse in the picture and you had to obtain a legal divorce. And again, we talked about the different types of marriages such as customary marriage, marriage by proxy, common law marriages. All those marriages are valid, and you may not necessarily have proof of a certificate of those marriages, but if you did enter into those types of marriages, you do have to have proof of an actual divorce certificate or divorce decree or death certificate in order to prove that you were legally able to marry your new spouse. Some of the other things that you have to be aware of and what the government will look at very carefully when you're applying for a spouse. As a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident, if you got your U.S. citizen, or if you got your permanent residence and eventually citizenship in some cases through marriage to a U.S. citizen, for example, you had gone through this process yourself of being applied for or sponsored by a U.S. citizen, and if you had been a permanent resident through that process for less than 5 years, then you are going to have to prove, in addition to the fact that you've remarried and that you have a valid marriage, you're going to have to prove that your previous marriage was not fraudulent in some way, that you did intend to actually marry and there was a valid marriage between you and your ex-spouse. So, for example, if you had only had your permanent residence for 3 years and had been divorced since that time from the sponsoring spouse, and now you have remarried and want to sponsor your new spouse coming from a different country, then you're going to have to go back and actually prove to the government when you apply for your new spouse that your previous marriage was indeed valid. You have to provide all the information that they may request to show that this was not a marriage of convenience for you to get your green card. So it's very important to know that in that case where you have been a permanent resident for less than 5 years, then you would need to show that to the government.